Welcome to Geopolitics Reloaded.
Understanding the power behind the headlines. I'm Rachel Maddow.
In the early hours of Christmas morning, as many around the world were still tucked in for the holiday, a grim new chapter unfolded in the war in Ukraine. Russian forces launched a massive aerial assault. Over 130 strike drones fired toward Ukrainian cities in the dead of night. Ukrainian air defenses, stretched thin by months of unrelenting bombardment, reported shooting down the majority of the incoming swarms. Yet dozens still penetrated protective screens and struck targets across multiple regions. At least 2 civilians were killed in the strikes, one in Odessa and another in Kharkiv, while dozens more were wounded and infrastructure was damaged amid frigid winter conditions as sirens and explosions shattered what should have been a night of peace. What makes this attack so stark is not just the timing but the trajectory of the conflict it reflects. Over the past weeks, broader bombardments have pummeled Ukrainian energy grids and cities alike, killing civilians, knocking out power in sub-zero weather, and underscoring the brutal calculus of a war that shows little sign of an imminent ceasefire. In some earlier strikes, Russia launched hundreds of drones and missiles in a single campaign, causing power outages and multiple deaths just days before Christmas. At the same time, Ukraine has been attempting to seize diplomatic initiative, unveiling a 20-point peace proposal under discussion with U.S. officials. Even as Russian leaders neither fully embraced nor constructively engaged with these overtures. In Kiev's command centers and in frontline towns, commanders warned that the tactics of night drone salvos are designed not merely to degrade military targets, but to break the will of a nation already 3 years into a brutal invasion. Civil defense units mobilized air defenses across multiple regions, and emergency services are now working through Christmas Day to assess and respond to the damage. This escalation underscores a stark point. Even on a night traditionally set aside for reflection and goodwill, the war's machinery keeps turning, inflicting pain and loss, and forcing Ukrainian civilians and soldiers alike to confront the relentless reality of a conflict that remains tragically unresolved. Russia's launch of more than 130 strike drones against Ukraine on Christmas night represents not just a numerical escalation, but a clear illustration of how the war has evolved into a sustained campaign of aerial pressure designed to exhaust Ukrainian defenses and terrorize civilian populations. These drones, primarily Iranian-designed Shate-type unmanned aerial vehicles and their Russian-modified variants, are relatively inexpensive, slow-moving, and loud, yet they have become one of Moscow's most effective tools. By launching them in large swarms, often mixed with decoys, Russia forces Ukraine to activate air defenses repeatedly, draining limited stocks of interceptor missiles and keeping cities on edge for hours at a time. The scale of this particular attack is significant. A launch of over 130 drones in a single night places it among the larger single-wave assaults of recent months and signals Moscow's continued ability to sustain mass production and deployment of these weapons despite international sanctions. Ukrainian officials reported that air defense units managed to intercept a substantial portion of the incoming drones, demonstrating both the skill and resilience of Ukraine's air defense network. However, interception does not equate to immunity. Even when a high percentage of drones are shot down, the sheer volume virtually guarantees that some will get through, striking residential areas, infrastructure, and industrial sites. The timing of the attack on Christmas night is also strategically and symbolically telling. Russia has repeatedly chosen holidays, overnight hours, and periods of extreme weather to intensify its strikes. These moments are calculated to maximize psychological impact when civilians are most vulnerable, when emergency response systems are strained, and when attention may be divided elsewhere. The use of drones at night compounds this effect, as their distinctive buzzing sound can linger for long minutes before impact or interception, creating prolonged fear rather than the instantaneous shock of a missile strike. Technically, these drone attacks serve multiple military purposes at once. First, they are a means of reconnaissance and targeting, forcing Ukrainian radar systems to light up and reveal defensive positions. Second, they function as attritional warfare, compelling Ukraine to expend costly surface-to-air missiles on relatively cheap drones. A single interceptor missile can cost many times more than the drone it destroys, creating an imbalance that Russia appears willing to exploit over time. Third, the drones act as a prelude or complement to missile strikes, softening defenses and overwhelming command and control systems. The Christmas night attack also highlights a key shift in Russia's operational doctrine. Earlier phases of the war relied heavily on large missile barrages launched intermittently. More recently, Russia has moved toward frequent drone, heavy assaults that occur night after night, This creates a grinding, cumulative effect: power outages, damaged infrastructure, exhausted repair crews, and a population forced to live with constant uncertainty. Even when casualties are limited compared to missile strikes, the persistent disruption erodes civilian morale and places continuous pressure on the state's ability to provide basic services during winter. For Ukraine, responding to such large-scale drone launches requires a layered defense strategy involving radar, electronic warfare, mobile fire units, and missile systems supplied by Western partners. The fact that most of the drones were intercepted on Christmas night underscores Ukraine's success in adapting and innovating under fire. Mobile air defense teams using machine guns and anti-aircraft cannons have become particularly effective against low-flying drones, while electronic warfare has increasingly been used to disrupt navigation systems. Yet these solutions are not limitless. Ammunition, spare parts, trained personnel, and advanced systems all depend on continued external support. The attack also has implications beyond the immediate battlefield. Each large drone assault becomes a data point in diplomatic discussions about aid, sanctions enforcement, and long-term security guarantees. For Ukraine's allies, the ability of Russia to launch over 130 drones in one night raises urgent questions about supply chains, enforcement gaps, and the sustainability of Russia's war economy. For Ukraine, it reinforces the argument that air defense systems are not optional or supplementary, but central to civilian survival. Ultimately, the Christmas night drone barrage demonstrates how the war has entered a phase where scale itself is a weapon. The number 130 drones is not incidental. It is designed to overwhelm, to probe limits, and to signal endurance. Each launch sends a message that Russia intends to maintain pressure regardless of season, symbolism, or humanitarian cost, while forcing Ukraine and its partners to constantly recalibrate how long such a defense can be sustained under relentless aerial assault. The confirmation that at least 2 civilians were killed in the Christmas night drone attack, one in Odessa and another in Kharkiv, underscores a grim and persistent reality of this war's civilian deaths are not accidental side effects. They are an expected outcome of how this conflict is being fought. These were not frontline villages caught in crossfire. These were cities far from the trenches, where ordinary people were sheltering in their homes during what is traditionally a night of rest, family, and religious observance. The fact that the casualties occurred hundreds of miles apart also illustrates the geographic breadth of the assault and the indiscriminate nature of the threat. In Odessa, a port city with immense cultural and economic significance, local authorities reported that a drone struck a residential area, killing a civilian and injuring others. Odessa has long been a target not only for its strategic value, but also for its symbolic importance as a Ukrainian city with deep historical ties to the Black Sea. Strikes there resonate beyond the immediate damage, reinforcing the sense that no part of the country is beyond reach. In Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, and one that has endured repeated bombardment since the earliest days of the invasion, another civilian was killed when a drone hit near housing infrastructure. Kharkiv's proximity to the Russian border has made it especially vulnerable, and its residents have lived for nearly 3 years with the expectation that nighttime sirens may be followed by explosions. Civilian deaths from drone attacks often occur not because of direct targeting of individuals, but because of the environments in which these weapons are deployed. Shite-type drones are designed to fly low and slow, increasing their accuracy against fixed targets, but also raising the risk of debris falling into populated areas when intercepted. Even successful air defense can result in deadly consequences on the ground. Falling wreckage, secondary explosions, and fires can turn a narrowly avoided strike into a fatal incident for people sleeping in nearby buildings. This creates a cruel paradox for civilians. Survival may depend on defenses that themselves carry inherent risk. The winter context intensifies the human cost of these casualties. Power outages caused by drone strikes can leave buildings without heat, lighting, or functioning elevators. Emergency medical services must navigate darkened streets and damaged infrastructure, often while additional drones are still airborne. In such conditions, even non-fatal injuries can become life-threatening. Hypothermia, delayed treatment, and limited access to emergency care disproportionately affect the elderly, children, and those with chronic illnesses. Each civilian death, therefore, represents not just a single moment of violence, but a chain of vulnerabilities exacerbated by the season. These deaths also carry legal and moral weight under international humanitarian law. While Russia consistently claims that its strikes target military or energy infrastructure, the recurring pattern of civilian casualties challenges those assertions. Urban environments, especially at night, dramatically increase the likelihood that civilians will be harmed. The obligation to minimize civilian casualties does not disappear because a weapon is cheaper, remotely operated, or difficult to intercept. Each confirmed civilian death adds to a growing body of evidence that will shape future accountability efforts, whether through international courts or historical record. For Ukrainian society, the loss of civilians during holiday attacks has a particularly corrosive effect. Holidays serve as psychological markers of continuity and normalcy in wartime. When violence intrudes on those moments, it reinforces the message that there is no safe pause, no respected boundary, no shared humanity that can be relied upon to limit the war's reach. Funerals replace celebrations. Families are left to grieve not only the loss of loved ones, but the erosion of traditions that once offered comfort and resilience. From a strategic perspective, civilian deaths function as a form of pressure. They test public morale, strain government resources, and aim to foster fatigue among both Ukrainians and their international supporters. Each fatality becomes a data point in information warfare, as Russian state media minimizes or denies civilian harm, while Ukrainian officials document and publicize it to underscore the stakes of continued resistance. The human cost is thus folded into a broader narrative struggle over legitimacy, endurance, and responsibility. The fact that only 2 civilian deaths were confirmed in an attack of this scale may, on paper, appear limited. But that framing misses the broader truth. Each civilian death is the visible outcome of a system designed to deliver violence into populated areas repeatedly and predictably. The number could easily have been higher. It has been higher on other nights. The randomness of survival is itself part of the trauma, leaving millions of Ukrainians to live with the knowledge that safety is provisional and temporary, dependent on interception rates, mechanical failures, and sheer chance. Ukrainian air defenses intercepting the majority of the drones launched on Christmas night is a testament to how much the country's defensive capabilities have evolved under constant pressure. But it also exposes the strain and fragility built into sustaining that success. Interception rates are often cited as a metric of effectiveness. And in this case, Ukrainian officials reported that most of the more than 130 incoming drones were neutralized before reaching their targets. That outcome reflects a complex, layered system that has been assembled in real time during wartime, integrating Western, supplied technology with domestic innovation and improvisation. At the core of Ukraine's air defense effort is a patchwork of systems with very different origins and purposes. Advanced surface-to-air missile platforms such as Patriot, NASAMS, and IRIS-T protect major cities and critical infrastructure, while older Soviet-era systems continue to operate alongside them. These are complemented by mobile fire groups, small, highly trained teams equipped with heavy machine guns, autocannons, and manned portable air defense systems designed specifically to counter low-flying drones. This layered approach increases interception rates, but it also requires constant coordination, communication, and situational awareness across regions that may be under simultaneous attack. The success in shooting down most of the drones does not mean the defenses are operating comfortably. Each interception carries a cost. Missile-based air defense systems rely on interceptors that are expensive, finite, and dependent on supply chains that extend far beyond Ukraine's borders. When a high-value interceptor is used to destroy a low-cost drone, the immediate tactical victory can mask a longer-term strategic dilemma. Russia appears acutely aware of this imbalance and has increasingly relied on mass drone launches to exploit it, forcing Ukraine to make difficult decisions about which threats justify which defensive response. Electronic warfare has become an increasingly important part of Ukraine's interception strategy. By jamming or spoofing navigation signals, Ukrainian forces can cause drones to veer off course, crash, or lose effectiveness. This method is cheaper than firing missiles and can be deployed across wider areas, but it is not foolproof. Russian forces adapt by updating guidance systems, altering flight paths, and mixing real drones with decoys. The result is a continuous technological contest, one in which interception rates fluctuate depending on adaptation speed, resource availability, and the specific composition of each attack. Human endurance is another critical factor behind these interception figures. Air defense crews operate through long nights, often with little rest, responding to alerts that can last for hours. A single drone attack is rarely a single wave, it is more often a prolonged sequence designed to exhaust defenders. Maintaining high interception rates under these conditions requires not only equipment, but trained personnel who can remain focused despite fatigue, stress, and the knowledge that any failure could result in civilian casualties. The psychological toll on these crews is an invisible but significant component of air defense effectiveness. The geographic scope of interceptions also reveals the breadth of the challenge. Drones are launched from multiple directions and at varying altitudes, forcing Ukraine to spread its defenses across vast territory. Protecting every city equally is impossible. Commanders must prioritize critical infrastructure, population centers, and military assets, knowing that some areas will inevitably be less protected. When officials report that most drones were intercepted, that success is unevenly distributed, shaped by strategic necessity rather than equal coverage. International support plays a decisive role in sustaining these interception rates. Western partners provide not only systems and missiles, but training, maintenance support, and intelligence sharing that enhance early warning and targeting. However, political uncertainty and production bottlenecks affect how quickly replacement interceptors can be delivered. Each large-scale drone attack accelerates the consumption of these resources, turning interception success into a countdown problem rather than a permanent solution. There is also a messaging dimension to interception reports. Ukrainian authorities emphasize high interception rates to reassure the public, demonstrate competence, and reinforce arguments for continued international assistance. At the same time, they are careful not to suggest invulnerability. The acknowledgement that some drones still get through is deliberate, underscoring that air defense reduces risk but cannot eliminate it. This balance reflects an understanding that public trust depends on realism as much as reassurance. Ultimately, the interception of most drones on Christmas night illustrates both resilience and vulnerability. It shows a defense system capable of adapting and performing under extraordinary pressure, while simultaneously highlighting the constant strain imposed by repeated mass attacks. Each successful interception is the product of resources, coordination, and human effort that must be replenished before the next wave arrives, often sooner than anyone would choose. The Christmas night drone attack unfolded against a diplomatic backdrop that, at least on paper, suggests movement toward a negotiated end to the war. Ukraine, working closely with the United States, has been advancing a 20-point peace proposal intended to frame discussions about sovereignty, security guarantees, accountability, and reconstruction. The timing is not incidental. As the war grinds on into another winter, Kiev is attempting to demonstrate that it is not only defending itself militarily, but also actively pursuing a political pathway that aligns with international norms and the expectations of its allies. The contents of Ukraine's peace proposal reflect lessons learned from nearly 3 years of full-scale invasion. Central to the plan are demands for the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, including Crimea and occupied regions in the east, as well as binding security guarantees to prevent future aggression. The proposal also emphasizes accountability for war crimes, the release of prisoners and deported civilians, and a framework for rebuilding damaged infrastructure. These points are not merely aspirational. They are designed to anchor negotiations in principles that Ukraine argues are non-negotiable if peace is to be durable rather than temporary. The involvement of the United States in shaping and discussing this proposal signals its importance. Washington's role is not just as Ukraine's primary military supporter, but as a diplomatic broker whose endorsement lends weight and credibility to Kiev's position. U.S. officials have framed the proposal as a starting point rather than a final document, but even that framing carries strategic intent. It establishes Ukraine as the party articulating conditions for peace, rather than passively reacting to Russian demands or externally imposed settlements. Russia's response, or lack thereof, has been equally telling. Moscow has neither formally accepted nor meaningfully engaged with the 20-point proposal, instead continuing to prosecute the war, while issuing vague statements about its own conditions for peace. These typically include recognition of territorial gains and limits on Ukraine's future alliances, conditions that Kiev and its allies have consistently rejected. The absence of substantive engagement reinforces the perception that Russia views negotiations as leverage rather than resolution, something to be invoked tactically while maintaining military pressure. The Christmas night drone attack fits squarely into this pattern. By launching a large-scale aerial assault while peace proposals are being discussed, Russia sends a dual message. Externally, it signals that diplomacy will not constrain its military operations. Internally, it reinforces a narrative of strength and resolve, suggesting that concessions are unnecessary and that pressure can still yield results on the battlefield. This dynamic complicates diplomatic efforts, as each escalation undermines trust and raises questions about the sincerity of any negotiating posture. For Ukraine, continuing to promote a peace plan amid ongoing attacks is a calculated risk. On one hand, it exposes Kiev to accusations, particularly from domestic critics, of engaging in diplomacy while civilians remain under fire. On the other hand, it strengthens Ukraine's position internationally by demonstrating that it is not wedded to perpetual war. The proposal allows Ukrainian leaders to argue that the obstacle to peace is not a lack of willingness to negotiate, but the incompatibility between international law and Russia's stated objectives. The diplomatic context also matters for Ukraine's allies. As the war drags on, political fatigue has become a real concern in some Western capitals. Peace proposals provide a framework for sustaining support by linking military aid to a broader strategy rather than open-ended conflict. At the same time, Russia's continued attacks, including on symbolic dates like Christmas, make it easier for Ukraine to argue that withdrawing support now would reward aggression rather than encourage compromise. There is also a strategic asymmetry at play. Ukraine's peace proposal is public, detailed, and grounded in international institutions. Russia's position remains deliberately ambiguous, allowing it to shift rhetoric depending on battlefield conditions and diplomatic pressure. This asymmetry benefits Ukraine in the information space, but it does not stop drones from flying or civilians from being killed. The gap between diplomatic language and military reality is laid bare each time an attack coincides with talks of peace. The interplay between negotiation and violence is not new in warfare, but in this case it is particularly stark. Peace discussions are occurring not after a lull, but during one of the most sustained periods of drone and missile attacks. This raises fundamental questions about whether negotiations are intended to end the war or manage it. For Ukraine, insisting on peace terms while under fire becomes a way of asserting agency. For Russia, ignoring those terms while escalating attacks becomes a way of testing endurance, both Ukraine's and that of its supporters. In this environment, the 20-point peace proposal functions less as an immediate roadmap and more as a diplomatic anchor. It defines what Ukraine is fighting for even as the war continues, and it forces every subsequent escalation, including Christmas night drone strikes, to be viewed not in isolation, but in direct contrast to an articulated vision of peace that remains, for now, unanswered. The broader context surrounding the Christmas night drone attack is defined by a sustained campaign of aerial strikes that have increasingly targeted Ukraine's energy infrastructure and civilian support systems during the coldest months of the year. These attacks are not episodic or random. They follow a discernible pattern that intensifies as temperatures drop and civilian dependence on electricity, heating, and water peaks. By repeatedly striking power plants, substations, and transmission lines, Russia has sought to transform winter itself into a weapon, amplifying the humanitarian impact of each successful hit far beyond the immediate blast radius. In recent weeks, these drone and missile attacks have caused rolling blackouts across multiple regions, leaving millions of Ukrainians without consistent access to heat and electricity. Apartment buildings go dark, elevators stop functioning, water pumps fail, and hospitals are forced to rely on backup generators. Even when power is restored quickly, the cumulative damage strains repair crews and depletes spare parts, making each subsequent outage harder to fix. This cycle of damage and repair becomes a form of attritional warfare aimed not at rapid territorial gains, but at wearing down a society's capacity to function normally. The choice of drones as a primary tool in this campaign is deliberate. Drones can be launched frequently at relatively low cost and in large numbers, making them ideal for sustained pressure rather than decisive blows. When paired with missiles, they create layered attacks that challenge air defenses and increase the likelihood of infrastructure damage. Even unsuccessful strikes force Ukraine to divert resources toward protection and repair, pulling attention and funding away from other urgent needs such as frontline defense and social services. Civilian life under these conditions becomes an exercise in constant adaptation. Families learn to plan around power schedules, keep emergency supplies, and sleep in clothes suitable for cold apartments. Schools shift between in-person and remote learning depending on electricity availability. Businesses close early or suspend operations entirely, deepening economic strain. The damage inflicted by these attacks is therefore not limited to physical infrastructure. It ripples outward into livelihoods, education, healthcare, and mental health. The winter setting magnifies the lethality of infrastructure strikes even when casualties from explosions themselves are limited. Cold weather turns power outages into immediate health risks, particularly for the elderly, infants, and those with medical conditions requiring electricity-dependent equipment. Emergency shelters and warming centers become lifelines, but they too rely on infrastructure that is increasingly fragile. In this way, attacks that might be survivable in warmer months take on a far more dangerous character during winter. From a military standpoint, targeting energy infrastructure blurs the line between civilian and strategic objectives. While electricity supports military operations, it is also indispensable for civilian survival. International humanitarian law requires proportionality and precautions to protect civilians, but repeated strikes on energy systems during winter raise questions about whether civilian harm is being minimized or strategically leveraged. Each outage becomes part of a broader pattern that suggests deliberate timing and targeting choices. For Ukraine's leadership, Managing the consequences of these attacks has become as central to the war effort as battlefield decisions. Officials must coordinate repairs, secure fuel for generators, communicate transparently with the public, and maintain morale in the face of ongoing hardship. Messaging around resilience, how long people can endure without heat or power, becomes both a practical and political necessity. At the same time, authorities must avoid normalizing deprivation, even as it becomes routine. Internationally, the impact of winter attacks shapes the debate over aid and support. Images and reports of darkened cities and freezing homes resonate with foreign audiences, reinforcing arguments for additional air defense systems and humanitarian assistance. Yet donor fatigue and competing global crises complicate sustained engagement. Each large-scale attack tests not only Ukraine's infrastructure, but the willingness of its partners to respond with speed and scale. The persistence of these strikes also signals a long-term strategy rather than a short-term escalation. By continuing to damage energy infrastructure despite repeated repairs, Russia appears to be betting that cumulative strain will eventually outpace Ukraine's ability to recover. This is a strategy built on endurance rather than breakthrough, one that assumes time and pressure can achieve what battlefield advances have not. As winter deepens, the interaction between drone attacks, energy systems, and civilian resilience becomes a central theater of the war. The front lines may be hundreds of miles away, but the effects of the conflict are felt in living rooms, stairwells, and hospital wards. Each outage, each repair, and each renewed strike reinforces the reality that this war is being fought not only over territory, but over the basic conditions of daily life in the harshest season of the year. Taken together, the Christmas night drone assault and its wider context reveal a war that has settled into a deliberate rhythm of pressure rather than pause. Large-scale drone launches, civilian casualties, strained air defenses, stalled diplomacy, and repeated attacks on energy infrastructure are not separate storylines but interlocking parts of the same strategy. Each element reinforces the other's. Mass drone attacks test and deplete defenses. The drones that slip through kill civilians and damage infrastructure. The resulting hardship deepens during winter, and the continuation of violence undercuts diplomatic efforts even as peace proposals circulate. The overall picture is one of endurance being tested on multiple levels at once. Ukraine's military endurance is challenged through constant aerial threats and the consumption of scarce defensive resources. Civilian endurance is tested through fear, loss, cold, and disruption to daily life. Diplomatic endurance is strained as negotiations coexist with escalation rather than relief. The war persists not because of dramatic advances on the battlefield, but because sustained pressure has become a strategic objective in itself. This pattern underscores a central reality of the conflict at this stage. Time is being weaponized. Russia's ability to keep launching drones night after night, even on symbolic dates, signals an intent to normalize violence and erode resistance gradually. Ukraine's response, intercepting most threats, documenting civilian harm, maintaining infrastructure, and articulating conditions for peace, demonstrates resilience, but at a cost that accumulates with each passing week. What emerges is a conflict defined less by single decisive moments and more by the compounding weight of repetition. Every intercepted drone, every damaged substation, every civilian death, and every unanswered peace proposal adds to a ledger that measures not only military outcomes but human and societal strain. The Christmas night attack, rather than standing apart as an anomaly, fits seamlessly into this broader trajectory, illustrating how the war continues to press forward through persistence, pressure, and the steady erosion of normal life.